Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to our second ARC International Seminar of the school year, which is our 116th overall. My name is Travis Seifman, and I'll be taking over from Professor Keiko Suzuki as chair for these seminars. Konnichiwa. 今年2回統計116回のARC 国際セミナーを開催させていただきます。私はサイフマン・トラビスと申します。今後、鈴木恵子先生の代わりにの後任としてこのセミナー司会となっております。どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。Today, all of our talks will be conducted in English. But I'm sure people are welcome to ask questions in Japanese, and we will translate for those listening who would like that translation. So, all right, let's get started. It's a pleasure to get to introduce our speakers for today. Who are Dr. Simon Kainer and Dr. Ryoko MATSUBA of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. And of the University of East Anglia, based in Norwich, England. Dr. Kainer will speak first on the topic of Stonehenge and prehistoric Japan. And then afterwards, Dr. Matsuba and several of her students will be speaking with us about implementing the ARC model in the UK, digitizing sword ornaments at the British Museum. So, Simon, it's all yours.
Travis, I believe you were going to show the video for me.
Sure. My apologies. I will do that. My apologies. We do have a video first. Here we are. All right, let me end the screen share so you can take over.
Thank you very much, Travis. And here we are. Hopefully this is coming up so you can all see that. Is that working?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, good morning, good evening, everybody. Konbanwa. Very nice to be here, virtually at least, in Kyoto with you all at Ritsumeikan University. But I think we've got a few friends and students listening in from Norwich as well, which is where I'm speaking to you from today. And it's Norwich Cathedral you can see just behind me, which is where we have the headquarters of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. So I'd like to begin by thanking everybody at the Art Research Centre, Dr. Seifman, Professor Akama, all of our colleagues and friends over there who do so much to help us deliver our programs about digital Japanese arts and cultures at the Sainsbury Institute. The film that I've just started with is a little bit of drone footage, which my colleague Dr. Corey Noxon, who's over the way at Ritsumeikan in the Department of Archaeology in Ritsumeikan University. Corey is a specialist in Jomon archaeology and joined me last September in Hokkaido and in Tohoku, and we were able to film some of the wonderful stone circles that Japan has so many of, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. But I'm aware that I'm talking to an audience of art historians and cultural specialists for whom prehistoric Japan may still be a little bit of a closed book. And I'm hoping that I can tempt you over the next 30 minutes or so to find out a little bit more about these remarkable sites, which certainly deserve a bit more global attention perhaps than they've received in the past. Now, international attention on Japanese archaeology is in fact nothing new. And this is a title page of a very early conference on prehistoric archaeology, which was held partly in my own city in Norwich and also in London in, of course, 1868, an important year for Japan altogether, the year of the Meiji Restoration. And this is a paper that was given by Augustus Wollaston Franks, who was one of the pioneering curators at the British Museum in London. And this is, in fact, it says, you can see the image says stone implements from Japan. This was the first academic paper to be presented on Japanese archaeology anywhere. And I'm particularly pleased that it was possibly given in Norwich, as I say, back in 1868. But the story of Japanese archaeology normally begins with this man, Edward Sylvester Morse, who taught at the University of Tokyo, the Imperial University of Tokyo, from 1876. And he undertook the first, what are recognized as archaeological investigations of any site in Japan at a place called Omori. And Omori is in between what was the port city of Yokohama and the city of Tokyo. And it was a series of prehistoric shell middens which were discovered when the railway embankment was cut right through the middle of it. And here's a reconstruction. If you go to Shimbashi Station, which is of course the original station for Tokyo, a railway that was designed by a British engineer, Edward Murrell, and parts of this railway embankment were in fact uncovered just a couple of years ago, 2021. And there's a big preservation movement underway at the moment as part of the restoration of the whole Shinagawa area. But about a 5-kilometer stretch of this original embankment has been recovered, and there are plans to try and preserve some of that. So that's in many ways the beginnings of what we might describe as scientific archaeology in Japan and its Western connections. Morse went on to publish the first archaeological report from a Japanese site, the shell mounds of Omori, really important for all kinds of reasons. It was, it's a great example for contemporary archaeologists because he published it within 2 years of undertaking his excavations. And he didn't only publish it in English, but he also published in Japanese, really setting a very high bar for subsequent Japanese archaeological work, particularly that undertaken by Westerners. One of the things I love about this, our archaeologists are very much concerned with chronologies. And you'll note that right at the bottom of that title page, it's got the date. In fact, it's got 2 dates. One is 2539, and the other one is 1879. Now, maybe 1879 is pretty familiar to those of us who work with the Western calendar. 2539 is dated from the process by the first emperor of Japan, the legendary Emperor Jimmu, who made his way from Kyushu to Nara in 660 BC. And that's the date 2539 that Morse, very scientific Western archaeologist, chose to use for the cover of his report. And this notion of different chronologies is rather important for archaeologists these days. And I think it's a good place just to start our talk. Now, on the Japanese side, the first professor of archaeology in Japan was Tsuboi Shogoro. In fact, he was professor of anthropology, Jinurigaku, at Tokyo Imperial University. And Tsuboi was described as being a most indefatigable archaeologist. He actually came to the UK and he spent 3 years, 2.5, 3 years in London, based on what is now University College London, where he was taught by Edward Tyler, the gentleman with the beard on the right, one of the founding fathers of British social anthropology. And while he was in the UK, Tsuboi visited what is, of course, now the most famous archaeological site in the UK, if not one of the most famous in the whole world, at Stonehenge. And he sent a report back. He published a report in the Journal of the Anthropological Society of Tokyo in 1895. And here it is. This is the first publication about Stonehenge in Japanese. And it's in there with some lovely illustrations taken from an early British publication on archaeology, John Lubbock's Prehistoric Times, and illustrated with other European important sites such as Karnak in Brittany, which you can see on the right hand of the screen. Morse and Tsuboi weren't the only early archaeologists in Japan, though. One of my great heroes is this gentleman, Neil Gordon Munro, who was a Scottish doctor who arrived in Yokohama at the turn of the 20th century. And he had typhoid fever when he arrived, and he checked himself into the hospital in Yokohama, and he subsequently became the director of that hospital. And he actually lived in Japan then until 1942, when he died in Hokkaido. But it was Munro who published the first synthesis of Japanese archaeology, this book, Prehistoric Japan, published in 1908. In his later years, he lived in Hokkaido amongst the Ainu, and he published extensively on the Ainu. And I think he would be very delighted to know about the new National Museum for the Ainu, the Upopoi Museum in Shiraoi, which you can see a picture of on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, in Munro's Prehistoric Japan, he published these photographs of the Oshoro stone circle, very close to the city of Otaru, at the top of the Oshima Peninsula in southwestern Hokkaido. And he didn't only publish photographs, but he also suggested that these sites had a particular orientation. They were oriented towards the 4 points of the calendar, and possibly also oriented on particular points in the landscape. And this is very significant for subsequent research in these important stone circle sites. And inspired by Munro's book, which was one of the things I had read when I was a PhD student, I headed to Otaru, who it must be getting on for 35 years ago now, taking the ferry from Tsuruga on the Japan Sea coast, arriving in Otaru at about 6 o'clock in the morning, and then taking the small train which led up to the hills where these stone circles were. And it's one of the first sites, Japanese Jomon sites, that I got to see in Hokkaido. And ever since then, it's been a bit of a dream to think, for me, to think how one can compare and contrast the stone circles that we find in Japan with, of course, these tremendous monuments that we have here in the UK, and megalithic monuments that extend across parts of northwestern Europe as well. The most famous of all of them, of course, is Stonehenge. And back in 2016 in Kyoto, when Doshisha University hosted the World Archaeological Congress, the largest gathering of international archaeologists ever held in Japan, I was lucky enough to bump into some colleagues from English Heritage, the British government agency which has Stonehenge in its guardianship, looks after Stonehenge. Until about 10, 12 years ago, this was the scene at Stonehenge. You can see the site in the top upper right. There was a big car park just on the other side of the road. The site was approached through a tunnel, and there weren't much in the way of decent visitor facilities. In fact, this situation was described in the British Parliament as a national disgrace some 40 years ago. 30 years later, a new visitor centre was opened just over 10 years ago. It's a wonderful structure, a light structure, about a kilometre away from the stone circles itself. And it has a temporary exhibition space in it. And discussions that were initiated at that World Archaeological Congress meeting in 2016 led to an exhibition, which we call Circles of Stone, which is currently at the Stonehenge Visitor Centre until September this year. Now, Stonehenge as a site attracts an enormous amount of archaeological attention globally. Here in the UK, every year there are new books published on Stonehenge, and there's an enormous amount of new research that's been going on, which is redefining our archaeological understanding of this important monument. Some people regard it as a kind of prehistoric calendar. For some people, it's a temple. For some people, it's a place to venerate ancestors. It's a place for the dead in Neolithic times, around about 5,000 years ago to about 4,000 years ago, in what in Britain we describe as the Neolithic and Bronze Age, and in Japan, it's the period of the Middle and Late Jomon periods. So let's have a think about the Jomon. Much of my career has been spent researching Jomon archaeology. And one of the things that people often say to me is, why should we be interested in what happens in that archipelago on the other side of Eurasia? And there are all kinds of reasons, I think. Here's just some of them. Perhaps Jomon people are most famous for their very sophisticated ceramics, and indeed some of the earliest ceramic containers in the world, dating to around about 16,000 years ago, way back in what we call the Old Stone Age, or the Paleolithic period. It's a long period. It lasts until sometime about 2,500 years ago, when rice farming appears in the Japanese archipelago. So it's a period which lasts getting on for 13,000 years. That's many, many hundreds of generations. And in that time, there doesn't seem to have been a huge amount of interaction with the East Asian continent, and all sorts of things happened in relative isolation in the Japanese archipelago. And one of them is that these Jomon people, and they were fishers, gatherers, and hunters. They weren't farmers, but they constructed considerable monuments, indicating a developed sense of their own historicity. And this is one of the themes, one of the research themes that I've been very interested. How do pre-literate, prehistoric societies mark the passing of time? How do they mark and remember their own histories? So just a little tiny bit about Jomon Japan for you, just in case you're not familiar. It's divided into 6 subdivisions, and there are many, many regional and local pottery styles which characterize the Jomon. And it's as if all the different communities, all the different societies that lived in the Japanese archipelago at this time identified themselves with signature pottery styles. And for my money, it's one of the most sophisticated prehistoric ceramic traditions from anywhere in the world. And it can be compared with some of the great expressions of prehistoric creativity, for example, the cave paintings that we see in southwestern France and other parts of Paleolithic Europe. Now, Jomon people lived in settled villages This is another aspect that's of very great interest to archaeologists around the world. This is the first time that human groups seem to have settled down and lived in one particular place all year round. And many of these village sites, and here's one in Nagano Prefecture, and what you can see here are a series of what we call pit houses. They're buildings, they're residences, dwellings, where the floors have been excavated into the ground. And you can see that it takes a kind of a circular pattern. And this circular principle is a very important distinctive attribute of many of these Jomon settlements. And they are often reconstructed to look something like this: a little cluster of nuclear family dwellings with some raised floor buildings, these buildings raised up on pillars, which may have been used for storage, may have been used for display. And this is something we'll come back to when we're looking at the stone circles. They had a great range of architectural forms. Unfortunately, as archaeologists, we tend not to discover the upper structures. We tend to find all that's left are the holes of posts, the fireplaces, and on occasion, the floors, which, especially if they've had special treatment, such as the one here on the top right, where we have a stone floor has been laid to make the building more monumental, if you like, probably last a little bit longer. Now, quite a lot of hard work going into building that kind of feature. You can experience what these Jomon settlements are like by visiting one of the many historical parks which can be found across the Japanese archipelago. Here is the largest at a site called Sannai Maruyama in Aomori Prefecture. And this is a settlement that was occupied about 6,500 to 5,500 years ago up in the northern part of Japan. And you can see there are a number of large buildings. There are some large monumental structures, such as this wooden structure on the left. And there are good archaeological reasons for being able to reconstruct these buildings in this way. And one of the things that has always interested me, because we don't have a record like this anywhere else in the world for prehistoric settlements of hunter-gatherers living in the temperate zone, we can really start to understand the occupational histories of these settlements and the ways in which these Jomon communities inhabited their landscapes over extended periods of time. Now, in summer 2021, 17 of these Jomon sites in northern Japan were inscribed as UNESCO World Heritage. They're described as the Jomon sites of northern Japan, and they are in the prefectures of Aomori, Akita, Iwate, and Hokkaido. And amongst these sites, there are 4 or 5 which have stone circles or features which are described as stone circles. And it's a focus on these particular stone circles that our exhibition at the Stonehenge Visitor Centre has today. And we published some articles about this, and my colleagues at English Heritage, who we've been partnering on this project, have come up with their own Yurukara characters inspired by the famous trilithon, these 3 stones, one piled on another, and the Jomon prehistoric figurines. And these accompany the exhibition as you go around. Our exhibition, following extensive delays due to the COVID pandemic, finally opened in September 2022, and we welcome the Japanese ambassador and the chief executive of English Heritage to Stonehenge to come and open it. And we got a lot of media coverage, and to date, I believe about 100,000 people have passed through the exhibition to get just a little taste of Japanese Jomon stone circles. We start the exhibition just by comparing what's happening in Jomon Japan with what's happening in prehistoric Britain. And there's a lot of dates on here. I'm not going to worry too much about any of those, but the colors that you can see in the middle of that, where it says late Jomon and middle Jomon and late Neolithic, these are the periods that we focus on in the exhibition. And it's around about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago. One of the things we wanted to introduce was what was happening in Japan at the time of Stonehenge. And we focused in on a particular pottery style, these flame pots, or the Kaien Gatadoki, from Niigata Prefecture, which again, I've been working on a lot over the years, and we have very good research partnerships with the Niigata Prefectural Museum of History and the city of Nagaoka in Niigata in particular. And we have one of these pots in the exhibition just to set the scene. Another theme we wanted to pick up on was the ways in which Stonehenge features in Japanese artistic production. And we found a wonderful example here of these woodblock prints by the Japanese artist Urushibaru Yoshijiro, who spent a number of years in England from 1910, and he created a whole series of woodblock prints about Stonehenge. And here is an example from the Salisbury Museum. I thought these might be of particular interest to Professor Akama, because I know that he likes his woodblock prints very much, perhaps more than his Jomon pots. We also wanted to look, we were very struck by some research connections in the history of the study of Stonehenge. This man is called William Gowland, and he's a very important figure in early Japanese archaeology. He lived in Japan from 1872 to 1888, and he investigated some 400 Kofun, much later monuments than our Jomon sites. These are sites dating to the 3rd century AD through to the 7th century AD. So what are we looking at? Around about 1500 years ago. And he recorded many of these sites, and he took photographs of them. And here you can see him taking what is perhaps the first selfie in the Japanese archaeological record that we have. When Gowland returned to England in 1888, he donated his extensive collection of Japanese archaeology to the British Museum. And he was subsequently commissioned to undertake archaeological investigations at Stonehenge, where some of the stones were falling over. And he undertook one of the first proper archaeological excavations at Stonehenge, informed very much by his work in Japan. He illustrated his report with pictures from Japan, which this is 1902. So this is extraordinary, really. So we've got explicit reference to what's happening in Japan in the very first decent archaeological report about excavations at Stonehenge. And this was another thing that we wanted to celebrate as part of our exhibition. It's been very interesting for me working with English Heritage and with the designers who they selected through a process of competitive tender, a company called Northover Brown, who came up with a fabulous design for the exhibition. And they were very much inspired by what their view of traditional Japanese architecture. And they wanted to have a notion of screens and windows, views through windows, the kind of things that perhaps are archetypical of traditional Japanese architecture for people looking from the outside over here in the UK. And this just gives you a little flavor of the way in which some of the artifacts, we borrowed about 70 artifacts altogether from our Japanese lenders, and they're all on display, as I say. And I know that some of you, I believe, will be coming down to Stonehenge with me on the 10th of May, so we'll be able to get to see the exhibition yourself. Here is the team who put the exhibition together. We've had a lot of Zoom meetings, many of which have had 20 or 30 people on them. The English Heritage is a very large organization, and of course Stonehenge, they look after 400 prehistoric sites in England, and it's been fabulous working with them, a very incredibly professional crew, and it's been a great pleasure to be putting this exhibition on with them. For the most part, access to the center part of the stone circle itself is very much restricted. But we were fortunate that the installation of our exhibition coincided with the autumn equinox. And at the two equinoxes and the two solstices, the summer and the winter solstice, Stonehenge is open to anybody. So lots of people come. On this occasion, about 5,000 people came to observe the sunrise at Stonehenge that morning. So we really got a sense of how the site operates when there's an awful lot of people there, which there's about 1.5 million visitors a year come to Stonehenge. And these days they're transported from the visitor center to the stone circle itself on special buses. This one, as you can see, it says "to the stones," and the buses have all been decorated with panels relating to our exhibition. There's a large volunteer community who work at Stonehenge, and here you can see them making their own Jomon pots and their own figurines inspired by a man called Graham Taylor, who makes a lot of replica prehistoric pots. And I think this engagement with the material culture is an aspect that I know is going to be a wonderful legacy of our exhibition. We were also lucky enough to be there to coincide with TBS Tokyo filming one of their episodes of something called Sekai Fushigi Haken, or Mysterious Discoveries from Around the World. And here they are inside one of the reconstructed Neolithic houses at Stonehenge, learning how to make cheese according to prehistoric methods. And my friend Shinya Shoda at the Nara National Institute for Cultural Properties spotted that this program was on and managed to get a couple of nice screenshots of me talking to the actor who was presenting the program about Stonehenge. In February, I was able to take two of the key people in planning and delivering the exhibition, Martin Allfrey and Heather Sabir, two of the most senior figures of English heritage. And we went to Japan, we went to Niigata, and we took part in what was called the Flame Pot Forum. In front of about 300 people, we talked about the exhibition itself and the comparative work that we're doing between Stonehenge and the Jomon stone circles. We wanted to see some of the sites themselves, but unfortunately it was February and this was all that was visible at the Oyu stone circles, just the top of what is called the sundial stone sticking out above the snow. But we got a very warm welcome from our colleagues at the stone circle sites that are lenders materials. Here we are at Isedotai and Oyu in Akita Prefecture, and we're currently working to see whether we can't come up with some arrangements to twin these sites with Stonehenge. You can see there's a model of Stonehenge right in the middle there at the Oyu Jomon Museum, and the volunteer groups around these sites are very interested in finding out more about the volunteer groups around the sites that we have in the UK as well. And maybe just drawing to a close now, I was particularly intrigued by these brand new displays these are small museums, tiny museums, on-site museums, but they are just revealing very high-tech new digital displays that allow us to really understand the ways in which the artifacts were discovered. The records that we've got from these sites are fantastic, and using holograms, using a whole array of new digital display techniques. This is brand new. I was very surprised to see this just this February, and working out the ways in which these new digital technologies are being used in these local museums, I think is something that I'm certainly finding of great interest, and I know would be of interest to many of our colleagues at the Arts Research Centre as well. There's massive amounts of research on Jomon stone circles. The themes that we've been able to pick up on so far are these long, complicated histories that these sites have and how we can reconstruct those, how we can use radiocarbon dating to really start to focus in on those chronologies. And we're in the process of putting together some academic papers, and we'll be having an academic conference on the 29th of August down at Stonehenge, when we'll be bringing some of these specialists together. There are about 50 stone circle sites in Japan altogether. I don't believe any of them are particularly well known outside Japan. Indeed, many of them are not that well known inside Japan. And I very much hope that our research and the exhibition that we've launched at Stonehenge, and that we're going to be doing another one at Avebury shortly, will increase interest in these sites and enhance collaboration, communication between archaeologists in Japan and archaeologists in the UK and beyond. And I think with that, I will stop, but I would just like to thank all of my colleagues at English Heritage who have worked so hard to bring this exhibition to to completion, and also to all of our Japanese partners in all of the Japanese museums, and our sponsors, in particular the Ishibashi Foundation, who are our primary sponsor. And I also want to thank the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation and the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, who facilitated some of the research trips both before and after the opening of the exhibition. Thank you very much indeed.
All right. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk, Professor Kainer. I've been hearing about this exhibit for quite some time, and it's a shame I have not been able to visit it, but it's exciting to hear all these different aspects around it. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to, I suppose, either raise your hand or enter them into the chat box.
See that Joseph has his hand up.
All right, go ahead, please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Kainer. That was a really, really fascinating talk. I mean, my area is Edo period literature, so all this kind of archaeological stuff is very new to me. But I was wondering, you mentioned Avebury just at the very end there. What you kind of charted is a very interesting kind of connection between, you know, Japanese scholars being interested in Stonehenge and there kind of being not a connection, but kind of like an interest there for a very long time. But has there been such an interest from the Japanese side in any other kind of prehistoric sites in the UK? And I suppose vice versa, have any other kind of exhibitions like yours ever happened before or anything like that in the UK about Japan?
Yeah, it was a great question. Thank you, Joseph. So yes, there have been exhibitions about Japanese archaeology before, and in an extended version of this talk, I might show you pictures of what we've been able to do at the British Museum, for example. Back in 2009, we had a very well-received exhibition about prehistoric ceramic figures, the Dogu figures at the British Museum. And indeed, in 2001, when the British Museum hosted a major exhibition on Shinto art, they curiously included a lot of Jomon archaeology as kind of the precursor of Shinto art. Now, there are many issues around that, which one could easily spend an hour unpicking, but there is a slight awareness of Japanese archaeology, but there aren't enough opportunities. And one of the issues that we do have is that there are about 7,000 practicing professional archaeologists in Japan. And they publish a phenomenal amount, all their technical reports. There are endless journals. There are many, many monographs that come out. I spend far too much of my time just trying to keep up with what is coming out all the time. But unfortunately, they publish 99.9% of this in Japanese. And there are not that many Japanese archaeologists who are comfortable to be publishing or speaking, a few, but not that many who are comfortable to be publishing or speaking in English. And that's part, we organized a workshop before we, back in it was January 2019, I think actually, when we introduced some Japanese specialists on stone circles to their European specialists. We actually ran this in Cambridge in January 2019. And I think exhibitions like this can provide a real opportunity for people to sort of come and compare notes and think about how they're approaching comparable material in different ways. And indeed, in the past, around the Dogu exhibition and some of the other exhibitions that we've arranged, we've always been able to welcome quite large groups of Japanese archaeologists and their colleagues to come to the UK and use that as an opportunity not only to see the exhibition, but to hear what the latest thinking is in the UK directly. Japanese archaeologists don't have time to read everything that's coming out in the English literature, for example. So anything that we can be doing to facilitate that kind of interaction is great. You mentioned Avebury, and indeed in that expanded version of this talk, I got some pictures of Avebury, because from May the 10th, we're launching a small exhibition, just a poster exhibition at Avebury as well. Avebury, for those of you who don't know, is a little earlier than Stonehenge, but it is actually a much larger stone circle than Stonehenge. So large, in fact, that there is a village in the middle of the stone circle, and there are still people living there. There's a very fine pub, and we've been invited by the parish council, in fact, to put on this small exhibition introducing some of the Jomon stone circles. And Avebury is in fact part of the same UNESCO World Heritage Site that Stonehenge is. So it's the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site. And I'm sure there are other sites that we would like to be working with as well in the future.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much. Avebury sounds like a fascinating site. I would love to visit there as well. Any other questions from anyone? I suppose I'll take the privilege as the chair to ask a question. I'm curious if you have any sense. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of newspaper reports and all kinds of, wonderful coverage, I'm sure. But I wonder if you have any sense of what regular visitors, average tourists, might be thinking about the Jomon exhibit, what they might be sort of taking away from that.
Great question, Travis. Thank you for that. And I know that my colleagues at English Heritage, based at Stonehenge, are gathering up views from visitors to see what they think. And although we'll pull all this together at the end of the exhibition, we've now got the summer season coming up. It's nice to have the exhibition on for a whole year. That's quite unusual. But I gather that all the feedback so far has been overwhelmingly positive. Obviously, people going to Stonehenge are going to see Stonehenge. They're not really going to go and find out about Japanese sites. But everybody has been saying, wow, we didn't know anything about this. We just had no idea that there were sites like this in Japan, as well as here at Stonehenge. And the message that I'm taking away is that actually, in a rather wonderful way, people are feeling that their visit to Stonehenge has been enhanced by the opportunity to find out a little bit more about another tradition of stone circle building in prehistory. The newspaper coverage has been very, very warm. We've had a journal article in the English Heritage members newsletter that went out to, I think, 1 million members just as for the exhibition to open, had a nice feature about the exhibition, and all of that has been generating good feedback as well. We will be doing a little bit of visitor feedback survey. It's always a bit of a nuisance when you're at an exhibition and somebody comes and bothers you to ask you what your opinion is about what's going on. But there are more subtle ways of doing it as well. And just, for example, just working out how long people are spending in the exhibition, how long they're spending looking at each individual piece. Are they actually reading the text, all of these sorts of things? And it seems that they really are. So I think what we've got is really quite significant public engagement with what we've been doing.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right, any other questions for Professor Kainer?
Hello.
Oh, hello, Sensei.
Okay, hi.
Good to see you.
Yes, long to see you. Hi. And may I ask some quite basic question for you? And anyway, thank you very much. Very nice, informative presentation. Thank you. And my question is about the special distribution of circle stone in Japan. As you mentioned last slide, there are no location for circle stone in West Japan. What is the basic reason for that?
That's a really good question, Yano Sensei. A little difficult one, to tell the truth. Maybe I could just say that, interestingly, there are many more Jomon sites altogether in Eastern Japan than Western Japan.
Yeah.
And there are a number of interpretations are put forward as to why this is. One of them is that the environmental conditions in Western Japan are a little different. And some Japanese archaeologists argue that the forests, the deciduous forests of Eastern Japan had much richer natural resources. There was much more to eat than there was in Western Japan. Having said that, though, there are a number of sites in Western Japan including around Kyoto and to the north of Kyoto City in Kyoto Prefecture and in Kyushu, where you do find monumental stone structures from the Jomon period. And I think it's very interesting and important to understand how they work as well. They don't get the same attention that the sites in Eastern Japan do. But I know in the archaeology department at Ritsumeikan University, that you have wonderful specialists there who know all about the Jomon of Western Japan. We do a little bit of work with them as well. I'd love to do more.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Yano Sensei. Thank you, Professor Kainer. I think we should probably, let's move on to Professor Ryoko Matsuba and her students, Joseph Bills, Bori Ko, and William Head, who will share with us some thoughts on implementing the ARC model in the UK, digitizing sword ornaments at the British Museum.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Travis. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. I'm truly grateful for the opportunity to be here today and share our insights on expanding the ARC model beyond the borders of Japan. Echoing Simon, thank you so much for all ARC colleagues and sister colleagues to make this happen. The ARC model has proven to be highly successful in digitally archiving Japanese cultural heritage. In a 2010 article, Professor Akama provided a comprehensive overview of its key features. Although the method has seen significant advancement since then, there are three core principles that continue to underpin its success. Firstly, a photographer has extensive knowledge of objects, enabling them to discern and prioritize critical attributes to guarantee their incorporation during the digitization process. Secondly, the photographic methodology used can be simple enough to accommodate the needs of researchers, rather than relying solely on the expertise of professional camera operators. Third, while digitizing objects, students can participate in the creation, which helps them gain a deeper understanding of Japanese culture. These principles serve as a solid foundation for the model's ongoing development and application, particularly in its potential adaptation as an educational program. Since 2007, ARC and the Japan section at the British Museum have been working together to catalog their Japanese collection. The project began with ukiyo-e prints and then expanded to the museum's rare book collection, which includes over 3,000 volumes of Japanese books. The ARC team visited the museums twice a year for 1 or 2 weeks. But due to the collection size, the project will take a considerable amount of time to finish. In 2011, I received a JSPS postdoctoral fellowship and became a visiting researcher at the Sainsbury Institute. This allowed me to continue photographing the collections daily. To speed up the digital archiving process, I was thinking of involving local students in the project at the British Museum. In 2013, I initiated the project at the British Museum to establish the foundation for the assistantship program in the UK. Before this, Professor Akama had already collaborated with local students from countries other than Japan, such as in the digitization of the Malega collection at the Don Bosco Library in Rome. Under Professor Akama's guidance, I served as a visiting researcher at the Free and Sakura Gallery, where I worked on the cataloging the Provera collection with US postgraduate students. Travis, who is present today, was responsible for digitizing the Provera collection as an intern at the time. Utilizing the existing program designs established by the ARC in the past, I implemented a similar initiative in the UK. Since the program's inception in 2013, we have collaborated with 24 local students from SOAS, University of London, University of East Anglia, University of Glasgow, University of Leeds, and University of Cambridge. During the last academic year, in collaboration with British Museum curator, Dr. Yano Akiko, we embarked on the digitization of their sword ornament collection with a particular emphasis on the tsuba or sword girls. We have no specific methodology for digitizing tsuba, making this our first project developing the digitization process for Japanese artifact with UK students. We received feedback from the ARC Isaac members who recommended to use 3D modeling technology, but neither the museum nor our team had done such a project before. As a result, Liam Head, one of today's speakers, along with Yuhan Ji, the Ishibashi Foundation Digital Project Officer at the Sainsbury Institute, had to develop the technology from scratch with guidance from Dr. Nadine Zuber of the University of East Anglia. During our talk today, we will be joined by 3 candidates from the program. Joseph Pierce, who recently completed his MPhil at the Cambridge University and is currently a MEC scholar at Keio University. Liam Head, an MA student at the University of East Anglia, and Bori Ko, also MA student at SOAS University of London, who will share their invaluable experience with us. We hope to share our experience on developing methodology to digitize the specific artifact, while also considering the perspectives of the student involved. Moving forward, we hope to discuss with other experts how we can enhance our program using ARC models in the UK. Now I'm handing over to Joseph.
Yes, thank you very much, Matsuba sensei. 皆様、こんばんは。今日はよろしくお願いいたします。As Ryoko just explained, this project's primary output was 2D photographs of the tsuba in the British Museum's collection. So I'm going to talk you through this process and what we learned and how we did it. We go to the next slide. So to cover some basic information first, as shown in this photo, we used Nikon D850 cameras and light boxes to capture both the obverse, i.e. the top, the hyomen, and the reverse, the underside, the udamen, of each tsuba. The project had 4 assistants overall, so we split into 2 teams, with myself and Bori, who will be talking later, working on 2 workstations to photograph as quickly and accurately as possible. In the 2 weeks, we managed to digitize 1,013 tsuba for a total of 3,924 images, and also an additional over 1,000 test shots and retakes if the images ended up being blurry or if there was some other reason why we had to do it again. This came to an average of 145 tsuba a day, when you consider that the first 3 days were mostly testing and we effectively started again on the 4th day or so to do the majority of the work. If we go next slide, please. Now, when we were taking these photographs, it was very important to have an idea of what kind of outcome we were aiming for. To do so, we looked at a lot of catalogs and decided that we wanted to try to emulate them, attempting to get as much detail visible with as little reflection and basically no shadow in the central hole. But effectively, we were unable to achieve photos exactly like this, especially with regards to the shadows. But that's for one simple reason. Images in catalogs are post-processed, things like shadows are removed and contrast is boosted to get as best a photo as humanly possible. We couldn't do this when we were considering that we had to deal with 1,000 tsuba within 2 weeks. So if you click to the next part, we were looking to aim for something a little bit more like this. Photos that are as accurate to the color and detail of tsuba as possible and with as little shadow as possible, but with the understanding that the complete removal was not possible. If we go to the next slide, please. So these are the kind of photos that we managed to take. What I have done here is I have cut them in the full photos. There is also a color chart to the left. but for ease of this presentation, I've cut them down to just the tsuba itself. If we click onto the next slide and we zoom in on one of these, there is a high level of definition, no reflection as such, and as little shadow as we could manage. The inscription is not too difficult to read, although we will get onto inscriptions later. Next slide, please. So how did we do this and what challenges did we face along the way? The first was lighting, and that's all related to the fundamental nature of tsuba themselves. They're made of metal, so they are shiny, they are reflective, they have a large amount of texture, and their inscriptions can be hard to photograph, so they're legible, and the holes in the center cause unnecessary shadow. So there's lots of problems you have to deal with. If you take a photo on basic settings with no lighting trickery, you get something like the bottom of the screen here, where you basically can't see anything. So we had to solve three main problems: shadow, texture, and detailing. The shadow was actually pretty easy to fix. We just put a light box underneath the item, so there was light coming up and cancelling out the shadow. The texture was a bit more difficult, as we found that focusing the light directly down on the objects caused reflection. So we decided to use continuous raking, i.e. there was a light coming from the top right-hand corner of the box, shining onto the light in a onto the object in a diagonal direction. We also found that counterintuitively, overexposing the photos was the way to go. We ended up with a shutter speed of 1/8 and an aperture of 14, which meant a lot of light was getting into the images. But it turned out to be exactly what we need to get the texture visible. Finally, there were the inscriptions, which proved hard to read even when we used the light box and raking. So the only solution to this was flash photography. But we couldn't only do flash photography, because then the photographs would not accurately represent the color of the original items. So what we did is we took a normal photo and a flash photo of each side, one for the color and for an authentic representation, and one for the legibility and detail. Bori will talk about this a bit more later. So with these settings, we managed to create photos a little bit more like this, if we click to the next part, which I think you'll agree are much more legible and much better photos. Next slide, please. But lighting, because lighting was not our only issue, orienting the tsuba also provided an unexpected challenge. The basic question was, what is the hyomen and what is the uremen? What is the obverse and what is the reverse? And who decides what that is? In most cases, this was easy. We just followed the recognized standard, i.e. the blade hole pointing up, the cloud-shaped Korgai hole on the right, and the crescent moon-shaped Kozuga hole on the left. Easy peasy. But then if we go to the next slide, we found that there were some problems with this. What happens when both of the holes are crescent moon-shaped? What happens when there are no holes at all? You might decide to determine it based on where the signature is, but what if there's no signature, or one on both sides? Others recommended the most decorated side be the top side, but what if both sides are identical? And finally, the accepted standard actually carves out a different rule based on what kind of sword the tsuba came from. If it came from an uchigatana, which was carried blade upwards, you point the blade hole up. But if it came from a tachi, which was carried blade downwards, then the hole should point down. However, the only way, as far as I understand it, the main way to tell which is to have the original sword, which we don't for most of these items. So this all became a bit of a minefield. Museum catalogues do follow these rules. Good examples of these can be seen in the catalogues by the MFA Boston, the Mitsumura collection at the Nezu Museum and at Tokyo National Museum. But a lot of them get away with it by not assigning an obverse and reverse, which is fine when both are photographed side by side and you can see them together, but not so much when they are two separate photos on an online database. So all we could do was be as consistent as we could in following the standards and basically take each one as it comes, try and get as consistent an output as we could. And that brings me on to my final slide, which is what we took away from this part of the project, which I think taught us a lot more than we were expecting. If we go to, yeah. The first point is the importance of consistency that I just mentioned. We were not in a position to decide which tsuba deserved to have flash photography and which ones didn't, so we did it for all of them. And that's why we ended up with 4 times as many photos as we have tsuba. We also weren't in a place to decide our own standards on what the top and bottom of the tsuba is, so we had to do the research and follow them as the standards as consistently as possible. That would allow our users to have as many options as possible. The second is the importance of testing. If we tried to go into this without doing a thorough set of tests and having the samples reviewed by Akama sensei, then our results would have been much inferior. And finally, there's the importance of compromise. We could never have taken photos that were perfectly adjusted with no shadow in the time that we had, because we would have had to change the light settings for every single photograph. And that was not possible. So what we had to do was find the best possible middle ground for as good an outcome as we could. So that's all from me. And now I'll hand over to Liam to talk about the 3D modeling side of this process.
Thank you very much. As Joseph just mentioned, I was primarily working on the 3D scanning and ongoing processing of scan data into 3D models for the Tsuba collection. Today I'll be mainly focusing upon the scanning processes, the challenges that we faced, and my opinion on the viability of the equipment that we used, as well as where I think 3D modeling could find its role in the future of this industry. Next slide, please. So the central device to this section of the digitization program was the SpaceBider 3D industrial scanner by Arctic 3D, which you can see on the right there, as well as its associated proprietary software, Arctic Studio 16. Whilst implied in its name, it is a scanner designed for industrial use, but there has been some use of it in cultural heritage. The hardware advertises its ability to capture scans in high resolution, as well as have ease capturing precision on smaller items, which kind of made it worth the trial in my eyes. It didn't perform without its issues for Tsuba in particular, but the challenges presented by the device weren't too problematic during those 2 weeks, but more for the processing afterwards. The scanner itself is a light and compact device, which kind of makes it easy to move around and to work on in the very limited spaces we were given, because all you need is a specialized laptop and the device itself, as well as the connections. The software itself had some limitations, but I will explain the weaknesses and strengths of everything near the end. As for the workflow, the way we did it is we had a base in which the Tsuba was held vertically in between 2 blocks of foam, because we could adjust the foam as necessary, depending on the kind of designs we were dealing with. And what we do a scan of that Tsuba in the vertical position, rotate it 90 degrees, do it again, and do that 4 times until we had effectively multiple scans of the surface of the Tsuba, and we didn't miss any. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, I couldn't get a 3D model on the screen because of various problems with PowerPoint, but on the right is kind of one of the ideal models that I looked at, and that's hosted on Sketchfab, done by the Museum of Fine and Applied Decorative Arts in Hamburg. And next to that is a few screenshots I quickly took of the first few scans that we did. And as you can see, there was quite a lot of detail captured, and it should just at least give you an idea of the kind of detail that you can actually get in 3D. And from those 2 weeks, we found the steps to actually achieving this lie pretty much entirely in the scanning process, not really the post-processing afterwards. And due to the nature of the software and the hardware used, there is actually very little user customization that you can actually apply to this, meaning you're kind of stuck with a very consistent, but a result that you can't experiment with, which is a limitation. So with the scanning step being the most important, it meant that you had to be very careful in your own method, and the particular type of Tsuba actually, changed how you'd approach it. So the general rule is the more geometrically complex and less flat the Tsuba is, the more conscious and thorough you have to be with your own scanning method. This is especially true of Tsuba, which have various 3D shapes on, like mainly animals had kind of destroyed the flat profile of a Tsuba, which meant you'd have to be very careful and conscious of what areas you've covered and which ones you haven't. So in order to best acquire, or in order to acquire the best output for this, you'd have to be very conscious on your own method. Next slide, please. Okay. The first and most persistent challenge that we faced was the reflectiveness of Tsuba, much like the 2D group, but also our own choice. So naturally, we went for the more eccentric and less flat and generally more interesting Tsuba, because we thought the most value lie with 3D if we choose the most unique looking Tsuba. And with especially those with gold accents or shininess, there was this issue we faced using the Arctic scanner. So the Arctic scanner has a feature called real-time scan construction, which creates kind of like a preliminary scan as you scan the object, so you know which part you've covered, you know which part you haven't covered. However, on reflective and especially metallic objects, as you can see from the top left picture, you get this very unrealistic looking Tsuba with all these anomalies all over the place. Whilst this doesn't appear in the final result, when you do the processing, you do everything on the computer, it does mean that you can't see which areas of the Tsuba you haven't covered and which parts you have covered. So it generally takes a bit longer and relies on your own process to make sure you haven't missed an important point of the Tsuba. So we did decide to spend the first few days trialing how objects would look in 3D, how long they would take per object, and just generally any issues that would come with that. As for the other images on screen, that's just the steps you take after doing the scan. So the bottom left is the preliminary scan data I mentioned. It's kind of like a low quality, low resolution version. As you can see, it doesn't have as many anomalies on it, but it's not a complete one-to-one of what you'd see later. You then create the overall mesh, which you can see at the top right, and then you'd apply the scans, which make the texture. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a very unique challenge that we faced actually, and it was mainly involved in the post-processing. I'm mentioning it here because there's a slight possibility that it could have been due to something in the scanning steps, but as of now, me, Arctic, and UEA are currently working on fixing this issue. Unfortunately, it's kind of getting slowed down because of the university lecture strikes. But to outline the issue briefly, when we processed a couple of tsuba on site, just to see if everything was going well, we found that whilst the geometry and texture data was intact, there was a strange kind of white tint, as you can see, on each side of the tsuba. Initially, we thought this was an issue with something external to the setup, such as reflection or lighting. But after looking at the manual and various information from Arctic, it seems that doesn't happen with the scanner, and that lighting shouldn't be an issue because the device itself provides its own lighting when you scan. A particularly interesting part about this was that the preliminary scan on the right doesn't show any white texture or anything. So I made the judgment that it's likely an issue with the processing step. So we decided to get as much scans while we were there for the 2 weeks, and then we'd work on clearing up issues like this afterwards. Some other conclusions that I drew whilst diagnosing this issue was that perhaps it was due to how we were scanning it, and maybe the base was merging into the overall tsuba. But even after we switched base designs a few days in, we had the exact same issues. So I'm not completely sure what's causing this, but in retrospect, what I've kind of learned from this is that it might be a good idea to actually contact Arctic or someone who's worked with tsuba before, using this device to make sure we know the overall issues, especially since the scanner's not meant for cultural heritage. So yeah, it's of utmost importance to actually check these kind of small things, which may seem fine, because they could result in issues like this. Next slide, please. So this is a kind of quick conclusion about what I thought about the device and the kind of setup generally. Starting with the strengths is that the scanner is very compact and light with the ability to be wireless. This makes it very easy to work in smaller spaces. It makes it very easy to transport around. And whilst it's an expensive item, about 20,000 euros, you can rent it. It should also be praised for its adaptability, even though the lighting where we were wasn't ideal a lot of the time. The scanner didn't have any issues, and it would capture no matter how dim or how bright an area was. Another major strength of this is that the device doesn't actually require any technical knowledge or familiarity, though I did find my own experience in 3D modeling and computer operation came in very valuably, especially when you're experimenting with fixing issues during those 2 weeks, because Arctic support, they take a few days to come back to you, and you can't just rely on them. Another thing that I was really amazed in was the geometry and texture capture for the small items. You can track chips, dents, and even the accession number on these tsuba, which make it a tool kind of unparalleled for its ability to capture detail. And finally, the software can be made automatic if you wish, but I'll explain in a second, but it doesn't always work as you intend, so you have to do that on a case-by-case basis. So as for the overall weaknesses, as I just mentioned, the software simplicity is its own downfall. Both for some people who may not be as versed in computer programs, they might not want to try and mess around, so there's less chance to go wrong because their software is especially so simple. But for those who might want to start experimenting with settings, you don't actually have access to these settings, so it's hard to control what you're getting out of the software. So it's consistent, but you can't change it. So there's a method called the autopilot, which basically does all this stuff for you. But sometimes this doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, then you have to go do everything yourself. So you have to press on these buttons, erase the base, and like align all the scans together, which increases the time taken. As I alluded to earlier, the Arctic scanner does have a feature to create a real-time construction of your scan, so you know what you're looking at, what you've scanned, what you haven't. And of course, you won't always be able to use this, because if you are getting anomalies and spikiness all over the tsuba, you won't be able to see. Sometimes you won't be able to see what parts you've missed. You won't be able to see what parts you've actually scanned. So overall, if experimenting with particularly strange or unique items which haven't been pioneered into yet, it's definitely worth checking with Arctic support and actually doing that initial research, no matter how small your concern is, because you don't know what kind of issues you'll face on the day with something as new as this is. So overall, whilst the device isn't actually designed for heritage, it does do its job well in some spots. Of course, you have to check for the item, because sometimes the metallic and reflective ones like tsuba have an issue. The scan has an issue with it. So it's definitely a safe idea if you are trialing to, be very thorough on what you do before going to actually scan stuff. Final slide, please. Okay, so I want to give my opinion on the place of 3D modeling in 3D digitization. And I think it does have a strong place in this future, especially in its unparalleled freedom that it actually gives to especially research-focused audiences. On, let's say someone wants to find a particular motif, like a reoccurring motif or a design or like a method. It gives people the freedom to observe these in 3D, which means you're not limited to a single perspective of a photograph. And it means you can control the lighting in the virtual plane to see more details, like, putting the light to a side to see the inscription better or the engravings better. And so, yeah, overall, I think, as shown in this program, if you follow the trend of going for the interesting than the handheld kind of items, you can make some really interesting looking 3D models. So in our case, the tsuba often had designs which wrapped around the edge. And of course, in a photograph, you can't follow this design all the way around the edge. So having a 3D model allows you to rotate seamlessly and follow these designs. One other thing was, as shown on the screen, you can see there's like a, as shown on the screen, there's a 3D model of a tsuba there. And there's these numbers on different parts of the model. And this is interesting because you can add little details and labels to the 3D model, which on this particular picture, there was a label on the motif, the signature, as well as an overview of what the item was, which gives you a level of interactivity, which just isn't present with photographs, which kind of increases the amount of people who would be interested in this kind of technology. One final thing I want to quickly mention was that storage space is kind of at an all-time low right now, and which means hosting and kind of holding these files locally is getting easier and cheaper, especially with the evolution of semiconductor electronics. So ultimately, I can see 3D digitization finding its place with especially smaller, more detailed objects, which you can hold. And whilst they do have value with larger objects, I find you have to be very careful with this, because you may have to get something more expensive. You need more people as opposed to the 1 or 2 people you need for this. But you also need the space for it. And I genuinely think it's just better to get the smaller and more detailed items for this approach, and you get the most value out of this. That's all from me for the 3D digitization techniques. And I do hope this work kind of gets the attention it deserves, because I think there's a future to be followed, a future for this kind of technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, for giving the idea of what 3D scanning digitization can show the researchers. In this program, I photographed tsuba in 2D. In my presentation, I'm going to talk about what 2D photos try to focus on and the meaning of digitization for scholars and the museum. If we go to the next slide. We aimed to provide researchers with high-quality photos for their study of the British Museum's collections. While a camera captures an object as it is, photography also reflects the photographer's interpretations. Therefore, we had to decide what to emphasize to effectively convey the visual information of tsuba. So, as Joseph already explained in detail, we took both normal photos and flash photos to highlight not only the actual appearance of the tsuba, but also the texture, color, and details of the decorations. Tsuba is normally made from various materials, including iron, silver, gold, and copper, and many comments wide variety of shapes and design with intricate decorations. As silver is made of countless hammering, some silver has very delicate and fine patterns that are sometimes hard to see in normal conditions. But high-quality photos allowed people to observe details that are not always visible to the naked eye. Especially the effect of using the light suggests a new perspective of the item. You can trace the hammered mark and identify inscriptions showing the name and writings of the craftsman. Our ultimate goal was to take photos to enable researchers could study even without having to see it in person. Next slide, please. So digitization is the first and most basic step toward preservation, archiving, and finally curations. Converting the physical collection into a digital format is adding value to the museum asset as a database for potential utilizations for its exhibition and education. In the museum, digital images help curators to recognize objects as potential subjects, and this can lead to the practice of digital curation, promoting culture and stimulating public interest. One important aspect of digitization is it increases the accessibility of researchers. Museum collections are vast and not always on display because of limited exhibition space or the need for the preservation of fragile objects. But in the digital era, high-quality photos made researchers to study without having to travel to the physical location of the museum. And they don't need to wait anymore for the artifact to be displayed. These suggestions resolve the constraint of time and space. Maybe go to next slide. Here you can see how the British Museum is already using digital data on its website. They have search engine for their collection by categories. Currently, almost 4.5 million objects are available, and the photos taken by our team are also going to be displayed here. Next slide, please. Also, they are doing digital curation through virtual exhibition, blogs, and collection on themes. They utilize digital data to enhance social function in the digital age. In addition, they are in partnership with the Google Culture Institute, so the public around the world can access the collection of the British Museum online as well. If traditional museums have focused on preserving artifacts and passing on cultural value to future generations, now museum has a new challenge to enhance their social function by actively adapting digital technology. Next slide, please. To conclude, I believe the interest and the importance of digitization continue to grow, and it not only preserves the collection, but also enhance their accessibility and usability, preventing information stagnation and encouraging international research, making improvement of research qualities. Moreover, digitization increases the amount of objects online. It fertile ground for large-scale analysis of data and searching for patterns and trends. Therefore, digitization holds great significance as valuable data for scholars around the world. So before finishing my presentations, I would like to say participating in this project was a valuable experience for me. Also, handling and photographing the beautiful silver collection of the British Museum was a great pleasure. And I'd like to express my gratitude to everyone involved in making this project possible. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Nope, go ahead, please.
Sorry. Thank you to Joseph, Liam, and Bori for sharing your valuable thoughts and experience with us today. Lastly, I'd like to express our gratitude to our various supporters, including the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, Ritsumeikan University, the International Joint Digital Archiving Center for Japanese Art and Culture at the Art Research Center, Ritsumeikan University, and the Ishibashi Foundation, as well as the UK museums, such as the Japan section at the British Museum and the Asia Department at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Now I'm handing over to Travis. Thank you so much.
Okay, sorry about that, Ryoko. Thanks so much, Joseph, Liam, and Bori for a very professional presentation. And I always find it just so fascinating how we work to photograph or digitize different types of objects and the different kinds of challenges and processes involved. So this is really fascinating. So we have, we have 8 minutes left for questions. So I'd be happy to any questions that anyone might have.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, please.
Wonderful presentations. Thank you very much. And what amazing results you're getting with this very sophisticated software. Can I just ask, what kind of research do you think this allow? You said it was, this database is likely to be used mainly by researchers. So what kind of research do you think this recording of these objects facilitates that it would not be possible to do if you didn't have such amazing high quality objects? High quality photographs.
Thank you, Simon. I have some thoughts, but do you have any thoughts, Joseph, Liam, Bori?
I can go ahead if you want.
Yeah.
So thank you for the question. I would say, so the main thing with the British Museum's collection of its tsuba, right, is that tsuba by nature are items that you have to really look at. The inscriptions are very, very fine. The designs are 3D. Like, there's something that's, if you describe it in words, is not going to really work, right? And out of those 1,000 tsuba that I mentioned, there are, I believe, 10 on display, and the rest are all in the back rooms, right? So considering that they are objects that you have to look at, that if you're going to be international, looking at it from an international perspective, you're not in the UK, it's going to be very, very difficult to get to it. And that sometimes a lot of these items are one of a kind. There aren't any other ones left. There are examples by the same, what would be the word, artisan, creator, etc., in other museums in Japan or elsewhere, but maybe not that exact thing. Without having these kind of photos and without having this thing available, you don't know what there is. Like, the actual totality of what even is still around and has been collected isn't even visible. So I think it's really, really important for access purposes as much as research purposes. Bori or anyone like to add to that?
Yeah. Any other comments, Liam, Bori? Do you think how? Yeah, I think for me is that because the tsuba is one object for all sort of fittings, and actually there are a lot of pairs like menuki, nikata, and kozuka. So I think if there's another, we can also find another pairs in the collection sometimes, but probably other pairs in the different collection, we can digitally put all together and research and recover the also other features as it was. That's sort of the interesting research about sort of fittings in the future. And any other comment, Liam? If not, we can go ahead. Another question.
Thank you very much.
Right. It seems to me that, it feels like a very basic thing, but whatever objects we're talking about, just having them digitized is such a huge, just to know what to request, right? You want to visit the British Museum, what do you want to see? So if you don't know what exists, I'd like to see this one with the monkey or this one with the, you don't know that it exists because it hasn't been digitized. Is at least one very basic aspect of it, I would imagine. Any other questions from our audience?
はい、じゃあちょっと赤間から質問
お願いします。
というか、I'd like to add one aspect, the digitization for the cultural asset, and usually and nowadays everyone want to digitize the kind of things, but the small thing is very difficult to digitize because it's we have to digitize the detail. For the small thing, detail is not a detail. I have enough English and ability. So small thing usually has a small design and small 何ですか、細かな彫刻。So it's very difficult to record that kind of information, and especially the 3D modeling for the small thing is very difficult. So this project is a very なんでしょうね、挑戦的な、プロジェクト、I think. So I like to add this aspect. And also, I have one question, very surface question. For the making the 3D model, how long time to make one model did you take?
It was usually, without the scanning, it was like 15-20 minutes at most. So it's kind of a fast process, but yeah, that's without the scanning.
Liam, how many objects you scanned in the British Museum for 2 weeks?
2 weeks.
I don't remember the number, but it's like 660 something. I can't remember how much it was.
Okay.
That was, of course, us trying to fix a couple of issues on site because Arctic support had to get back to us after a few days.
そしたらどれぐらい何分ぐらいで何分とか
10分後、15分から20
15分で1。
そう。でもそれはスキャンを除いて、スキャンする時間は、なんか、Liam, how long did it take to actually scan it?
About the same amount of time. So like 15-20.
だったら合計で30分。
で、それだけでもうモデルが出来上がって、で、そのファイルを書き出せば、スケッチハブとか、そういうところに載せられるファイルになるんですね。かなりやっぱり早くなったんだよね。でそれだったら、まあ、ぜひ、どんどん進めたいというレベルに今あるんだなという、感想です。はい、ありがとうございます。
All right. Thanks so much, Professor Akama. I think we're out of time, I'm afraid. So let me just very quickly, I want to thank all of our presenters. It's a real pleasure to have here, and it's a pleasure to sort of continue this wonderful friendship and close partnership between the ARC and the Sainsbury Institute. Simon and Ryoko have certainly been good to me in my personal academic professional journey, so it's wonderful to connect with you and continue to speak with you.